police anymore. It's fuck the FBI.
Stomach sick, it's getting harder to breathe.
Criminals! You're all fucking criminals! You wear that fucking badge!
There is nothing to praise. Will you come with me? Will you stand with me? Would you follow me? Would you believe with me? Tell me you'll agree with me. Tell me you'll die with me. Come on, let me hear your war cry. Come on, get on to me, your war cry. Come on, get on to me, your war cry.
You are listening to Free Talkcast, where we talk about news and current events from a perspective of peace, love, and liberty. I'm your host, Arya DeMezzo, and let's get right into things. Hi, I'm sitting here today with Rob Roselli, the author of Theory of Levolution and Deep State Expert. And this is particularly poignant today, right after the election of Donald Trump, because Donald Trump, of course, ran in 2016 largely on a slogan of draining the swamp, which I don't think really happened. And he didn't say that in this latest election campaign. Instead, he campaigned on other things. But what is the deep state? I guess is the best place to start here, because a lot of people use that term in different ways. What would you say is the deep state, Rob?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on.
Yeah, sorry, I skipped over all of that.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. The book or my website's They Live, Great Society of the Undead. And the website's actually boxofsunglasses.com. And that's in honor of my favorite movie, John Carpenter's They Live, came out, I think, in 1988 or so.
Okay, and you said that's boxofsunglasses.com?
Yes, it's all one word.
Okay.
And that's, Roddy Piper finds the box of sunglasses in the movie and he sees everything. And that was kind of the inspiration behind the name. And God's Simple Salvation Plans at the top of the webpage. And if people get nothing else out of this interview, that's there on the website. And but be that as it may. So to answer your question, what I call the deep state, how I like to define it, I call it the Un-American Genocidal Complex, and that's the title of my second book, available on my website. But it's basically a conglomeration of all the groups that some people may have heard of: the Bilderberg Group, your Council on Foreign Relations, your Illuminati, the American version of Illuminati is the Order of Skull and Bones at Yale University. That's not conspiracy theory. There is a real society there, and they have produced the overwhelming majority of our so-called leaders, politicians, business leaders, media moguls, etc. These are people that control everything: the media, academia, the banks, the Federal Reserve System. Those intertwined names include Rockefeller, Rothschild banking interest in Europe. J.P. Morgan this is going back to the foundation of the Federal Reserve. Many of these families and their descendants are still around. David Rockefeller passed away in the last few years. He was
Thank goodness.
One of the inspirations behind the United Nations. What I call the undead Federal Reserve System, the CIA, the Office of Strategic Services was the predecessor to the CIA. So I guess if you take all those groups and you put them in the pot, and they all are interconnected and intertwined. And I have actually a chart on this in my book, The Un-American Genocidal Complex. So those aforementioned names and groups, I would say, comprise as the tip of the pyramid of the so-called deep state. And again, what President Eisenhower, when he was president, he warned us about the military-industrial complex. Some people go by that name. Some people go by the Eastern Establishment.
You mentioned conspiracy theories there, and that's something that's always fascinated me, because a lot of these things are written off as conspiracy theories. And the Illuminati aside, because that one could be just a conspiracy theory, but the Bilderberg Group, the Council of Foreign Relations, the Skull and Bone Society, those are all documented facts. We know with certainty that billionaires around the world, that politicians around the world are meeting at relatively secret locations, and well, they don't announce it beforehand, I guess would be the best way of characterizing that. They're meeting behind closed doors and they're having secret meetings, and some of these meetings, the logs of them have been leaked. And I can't remember now exactly where these documents were sourced from, but I've read some of them, like from the 1960s Bilderberg Group meetings, and it's alarming how much, I want to call it foresight, but it wasn't foresight. They were planning the fall of the Soviet Union and what they were going to do in response to that. And it's one thing to say, wow, these guys were really on top of things. They were playing the long game to plan things out, but that's exactly what they were doing. They weren't predicting the fall of the Soviet Union. They were taking actions then in the 1950s. I believe it was 1952 was the one that I'm thinking of. They were planning back then how they were going to collapse the Soviet Union and move forward into pretty much exactly what we have today. And if we had meetings from the 80s, we would probably find that they were predicting the state of the world today as accurately as the people in the 50s were predicting the state of the world in the 80s. And people just write all of this off as conspiracy nonsense, but it's documented fact that these world leaders, these billionaires, these elites, so to speak, are meeting behind closed doors and are planning ways to control the world.
Well, that's exactly correct. Let me just to kind of add on to what you were saying. Let me just say this for starters. I mean, the Illuminati. I mean, they are a historical group. I mean, the Bavarian Illuminati. They started in Germany. They migrated here, and that manifested itself in the Order of Skull and Bones, which I mentioned before, and that's why I call it the American Illuminati. And the inspiration behind that is illuminated as your eyes shall be open. That goes all the way back to Genesis 3. I'm a big believer that the Bible is the core of the quote conspiracy. But kind of just thinking back on point here. Yeah, I mean, look, the Soviet Union, and I get into this a little bit in my first book, They Live, Great Society of the Undead. The original communism was a creation of Wall Street. Okay, this is documented in a book called Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution by William Sutton. So the American financiers were behind communism. They're behind liberalism, socialism, American liberalism, which is just really, let's just get right to the point. It's just a fancy name, or it's a peaceful way of communism. And the reason, it seems contradictory that the biggest bankers in the world, the mega capitalists, your Rockefellers, your Morgans, your Rothschilds, etc., would be behind communism. But when you think about it, communism isn't really, power to the people. That's how it's sold to American liberals. But it is actually a conglomeration of power, or a centralization of power and control. With that, they control the Soviet Union, which they hate. I mean, Russian Orthodox, and that same hatred is manifested today in this war against Ukraine. But just to kind of not go down that rabbit hole right now. But the Soviet Union was created to kind of bring this bad boogeyman into the world, for the military-industrial complex to enrich itself, to have an enemy for all those decades. That the United States could be in this so-called Cold War. It made a lot of people very rich, namely the banking families I just mentioned, because they do control the Federal Reserve, right, from which the American government military-industrial complex, uses money from the Federal Reserve to fund itself. So they're making money, going both ways. For example, just as an example of that, real quickly, when J.P. Morgan in World War I was an owner and a founder of the Federal Reserve System, which was loaning money to Europe, which was then turning around and buying arms from many of the factories, General Electric and whatnot, that J.P. Morgan owned. So they're making money both ways, if that makes sense. So it's a very big game. It's a very complex game. Now, the Soviet Union, did fall. Communism did fall, in the early 90s. I can't exactly say what the inspiration or what was behind that, but be that as it may, we now have another common enemy, and that's, an enemy in China. Russia is still not really our friend, and that's becoming more and more apparent, as as of today, I mean, they're not really excited about what the United States has done in Ukraine, Donald Trump notwithstanding. So,
You mentioned World War One there, and I think that's something that a lot of people should go back and study a bit because so much of the focus is on World War Two, and like that is obviously important for people to know about and to study and to learn lessons from. But the current state of the world really began in World War One. That was when the corporations went to the government and said, "Hey, we want to form these cartels. Effectively, we want to make these organizations that control these massive industries, and we want to work with you to do it." And it was called, and it was mobilization. It was mobilization of the entire country to throw itself behind the war effort, and that began in World War One. It then reignited in World War Two. After that, it just never went away. There's a reason that the U.S. government was buying so many Jeeps from the manufacturer of Jeeps. I think at the time it was just the Jeep company, but regardless, it all began in World War One when these maybe they weren't billionaires at the time, but when these owners of these massive corporations went to the federal government and said, "Hey, we want you to give us money," because in the government they had guaranteed customers. And of course, there's Lockheed Martin paying for bombs. It is a military industrial complex. As you mentioned, we had a previous president come along, and I always want to call him Eisenhower, but I don't think that's correct. Which president was it who gave the speech warning about the military industrial complex?
it was Eisenhower.
It was, okay.
On
Yeah,
his way out. Yeah.
and he helped create the thing, right? And he came along and said, more or less, "Whoops, my bad, but this thing is here now and it needs to be sort of dealt with." Then there's, of course, the JFK assassination, which not worth getting into the nuances of that, but all of these things sort of tie together, and it looks like corporations and fascism effectively took over the world in World War One, cemented its control in World War Two, and has never let go since. And I don't think people realize the actual state of affairs that we see right now. Like we have the richest man in the world now is firmly controlling the United States government in a way that is completely unelected and can effectively go in and do whatever he wants. And I don't know where people draw the line between fascism and whatever they imagine the current system to be, but those sorts of things aren't supposed to happen in a democratic republic. It's pretty clear to me that we fall into a fascist oligarchy, and we did so around World War One.
Well, it sounds like you're kind of alluding to the Federal Reserve System, either quote federal, quote reserve system, which is not federal. There are no reserves. It's totally a debt-based system, which makes it mathematically impossible to ever pay off.
This is why I'm a huge advocate of cryptocurrency.
So maybe we get that in a little bit, but to kind of answer or follow up on your comments and your question, the Federal Reserve is a sort of fascism. It's a privately owned cartel. The Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution specifies that Congress, mints money and sets the value of money. And by the way, just to mention JFK, I mean, one of his major problems, or one that he got him into trouble, trying to be a real president, was trying to compete with the Federal Reserve note by issuing Executive Order 11110, which was debt-free United States Treasury silver coins that would compete with the Federal Reserve System. And of course, we don't know what happened. They blew his head off in broad daylight as a message to subsequent presidents to stay in line. But kind of getting back to the point, the Federal Reserve System, as it was founded in 1913 by the sellout Woodrow Wilson, the progressive sellout, who, by the way, promised to keep us out of World War One, and we all see how that worked. But he was beholden to his Federal Reserve criminal masters. Again, those same names: Rothschild, Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Warburg, and others. A combination of European and American banking interests started the private Federal Reserve, and that is a form of fascism. I mean, government privately owned and government controlled is more or less the definition of fascism. And that's what we have with the military industrial complex. I mean, it's a very tight knit group. It's a very cozy relationship. We spend trillions of dollars on so-called defense over the past century. And of course, to finance that, we had to borrow from the Federal Reserve, the same people that own these corporations. Okay,
Back
like
up a
Germany.
bit, because I don't think most people realize it, but the United States government, all of this money that it's spending, it is in fact borrowed from the Federal Reserve, as you were just saying. And I don't think a lot of people realize that. And a lot of what we're saying here sounds like crazy conspiracy theories to people. But again, these are all documented facts. Like, we know a U.S. senator met on an island in secret with the Rothschilds, with the Rockefellers, and with several others, and that they wrote, the bankers themselves wrote the Federal Reserve Act. That senator, who went on to marry one of the bankers' sisters or something, he married into one of the banking families. He went to the Capitol Hill at a time when most of these senators and representatives were home for Christmas vacation. He proposed the legislation. It got passed. And ever since then, everything that we do in the U.S. economy puts us further and further into debt. Everything that we spend is given to us as a loan, and it's all got interest attached to it. If the federal government borrows $100, it has to pay back $101, for example. Well, how can they borrow back that extra dollar if it doesn't exist? Well, the only thing they can do is to borrow more money. And by doing that, the amount of interest just steadily accumulates until it's, what is the debt now? Something like $20 trillion? That's how we ended up with a $20 trillion debt.
The online deficit. Now, you're exactly correct, and I do use that analogy when I try to explain the Federal Reserve System to other people. Like, if I'm the Fed and you're the government, the only way for you to operate, and you've ceded control of your economy to me. That's how stupid the system is. But if I loan you $100 and charge you interest on it, and you go and spend it, you spend it on defense, welfare, Social Security, whatever. The only way for you to keep the system going is to borrow more money from me. So it's a system of perpetual debt. It's impossible. It's mathematically impossible to pay off. That's just simple. That's just the way it is. I mean, for the United States to pay off the national debt would have to suck every dollar out of circulation back into its coffers and pay the Federal Reserve. But as you mentioned, there's interest, and they didn't even do it at that point because there's interest on the debt. So they're creating money out of nothing and charging interest on it.
That's exactly it.
That's how bad this system is. And
even if the U.S. did manage to suck in all of that money and pay it back, they would still owe money because of that interest. I watched a documentary a long time ago that described it as a game of musical chairs. Someone is always left without a chair. And that's exactly what we have going on here. There's always one chair too few. And because of that, someone or something is always getting screwed over. And it's universally we, the people, getting screwed over by this system.
That's exactly correct. I mean, Proverbs 22:7, the debtor is slave to the lender, and we're all debt slaves. But the people that founded this system, I mean, these are very smart people. I mean, they're evil to the core. I mean, these are people that created Adolf Hitler, as I document in my book, The Un-American Genocidal Complex, for example. This is how evil these people are. But be that as it may, they also came up with something called the tax-exempt foundations, where now, just as an aside, they created, the IRS and the federal income tax. We didn't have one before 1913 in the Federal Reserve System. That's how the government pays the debt, every year, but it really doesn't. All it's really doing is treading water and paying the interest. But so think about that. The same people that created this monster, the Federal Reserve System, also created the federal income tax to get us suckers out here and the imbecile majority to pay for it all. And on top of that, they created something called the tax-exempt foundations, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the Carnegie Endowment, the Ford Foundation, et cetera, et cetera. And what they do is they fund a lot of these so-called institutions of higher learning in this country. So this is how they pull the scam off, is that, they just dumb people down. They just blanket us in nonsense. Economic experts and Nobel Peace Prize winners like this douchebag, Paul Krugman at the New York Times, that says, debt is good, and we need to go into debt to get out of debt, and we need to spend money on social programs and whatever. He's just beholden to his banker overlords, because by going into debt, we're borrowing from the Federal Reserve System and enriching those people who are already the richest people in the world. Okay, but again, they control academia. So all the experts, when the Fed chairman gets out and everybody, all these butt kissers on Wall Street, the Fed, what's the Fed going to do? What's the Fed going to do? It's an unelected cartel. But we've been so brainwashed that, to question it is conspiracy theory, but it's just at its core, it's basically a Ponzi scheme. Okay, is what it is, because you have to pay off yesterday's investors with today's money. It's a classic Ponzi scheme, except it's only worse. And we're a Ponzi scheme where you actually have to work to get people's money to pay off yesterday's investors. If the government falls short and it can't pay off yesterday's investors with today's money, it just simply prints the money. So it's a Ponzi scheme with a twist. It's just that simple. And this is why, alluding back to the beginning of the show where I said my favorite movie is John Carpenter's They Live, and Roddy puts on the sunglasses and he starts reading all these magazines, with all these complex graphs and these newspapers and all this other nonsense. And it's just, stay asleep, obey,
Hmm.
get married, watch TV, all these messages start coming out. And that's what we are. We're a dumbed down society. We're constitutionally illiterate. And because, again, they own the education system. This is why the education system is decidedly liberal. And anti-American, because they don't want us to understand our founding documents and the founding fathers. Just real quickly, I mean, this whole Federal Reserve System, basically, it's the third central bank. I mean, I used to teach you this stuff in high school, so it's not really conspiracy theory. The private bank, this is going back to the Alexander Hamilton Federalists versus Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Democrat Republicans who didn't want a central bank, who said it's not constitutional. Okay, so we had a charter. It was disbanded 20 years later. There's a 20-year charter, and it was reignited again after the War of 1812, which was the Bankers' War. But I don't want to tool off target here. But Andrew Jackson, basically got the presidency. He said Andrew Jackson and no bank. He's talking about the central bank. Okay, the second charter, now the third charter.
Yeah, didn't Andrew Jackson refer to them as a den of vipers and thieves?
Exactly. And Andrew Jackson was an American war hero. Okay, I get it. He wasn't perfect with the whole Trail of Tears, and we don't want to go off on that tangent right now. But in terms of a war hero and getting rid of the Federal Reserve System, yes, he called them a den of vipers and thieves, which is right out of Matthew's gospel. Jesus talking to the Pharisees and the money changers. And we did not have a central bank until the aforementioned Federal Reserve System in 1913. And ever since 1913, we've had this cartel basically running the nation. Let's face it. I mean, who controls the purse strings controls the nation. And Rothschild, I think Amsel Rothschild, the original Rothschild, he had 5 sons who took over the central banks of England, France, Italy, Germany, and Austria, I believe it was. Became very powerful. He said, give me the power to control the nation's currency, and I care not who makes its laws. I mean, talk about an arrogant SOB. There it is. But you know something? He's right.
Yep.
He's right. I mean, to talk about the Federal Reserve the way we're talking is conspiracy theory. I mean, look what they did to Martha Stewart. I mean,
It definitely concerns me that people don't take this subject very seriously. Maybe you have some thoughts about this, about how we can get people to take it seriously, but the money that people have, the money that I have, and the money that everyone out there is using, it runs our lives. We need it to buy food. We need it to pay our rent, to pay our mortgage, to buy gasoline. We absolutely require money in order to survive. And the average person has no idea where that money comes from. They just assume it comes from the government. Obviously, it doesn't. And when we try to explain these things to people, say, hey, look, the money that you're using has lost more than 95% of its value since this cartel started running things, their eyes glaze over and they have no interest whatsoever. And we would all be roughly 20 times richer right now than we are if not for the Federal Reserve Bank. And they're just like, no, it's Biden's fault or it's Trump's fault. And the issues here run so much deeper than that. And they're just looking for these simple, cursory explanations that don't actually explain anything when the actual solution isn't really that complicated and it falls more or less in line with everything we see. Yeah, a banking cartel runs the United States and they're enriching themselves at our expense. It's really that simple. And they just have no interest in it. Is there anything that you've seen that's been successful in getting people to take this topic seriously?
Not really. I mean, John chapter 10, I mean, basically people are sheep. We're created as sheep. That's our human nature as God created us. So, people just, again, it's that whole they live scenario. People are so used to it, they're so accustomed to the system as it is that they don't question it. And as you mentioned, that's a good point and something I'm kind of get to, but is this fact that the Federal Reserve System, they promised to stabilize the economy. 1913, and 13 years later, or 16 years later, we had the Great Depression, and as you mentioned, our currency has lost like 98% of its value since the system was created. Now that's the real cause of inflation. I mean, I get it's
Yes.
supply and demand, and that does play into it a little bit. But the reason a house that cost $30,000 back in the 1960s costs like almost $1 million today is because of the fake Federal Reserve System. It creates money out of nothing. So basically, it's akin to the banker in a game of Monopoly, just throwing money out to all the players. Okay, what's that going to do? Your property values have to go up because everybody has so much more money to spend, but it's not real money; it's paper money.
Yep.
And
Have
don't
you
forget,
noticed that the U.S. currency more and more these days resembles monopoly money? Like, they're not even hiding anymore. Our $5 bills are pink. Our $10 bills are yellow. Our $20 bills are green, just like in Monopoly.
it's almost like a mockery. That and I've quoted. I mean, when you read the elites and the New Agers and the people that they listen to, like Helena Blavatsky, the occultists, the devil worshippers, and again, the Bible is the core of the conspiracy. But I don't have time to go into that right now. But yeah, it's almost like a mockery. Like, you people are so stupid. We own you, and you don't even know it. I mean, basically, the Federal Reserve System, the establishment, was basically a coup. Okay,
Yeah.
and things like the pristine bullet with the Kennedy assassination, where the fragments that they recovered out of Kennedy's and JF and Connolly's bodies was more than a pristine bullet. Well, this is a bullet that. So it's stuff like that, and they gave us the Warren Commission, like 20 volumes of nonsense to explain a very simple thing.
And it relied on a magic bullet that they literally called a magic bullet. And the masses of people were just like, yep, this checks out.
And that's just an example. But again, JFK was the one who's taking on the Federal Reserve System. But it's almost like a mockery, okay, a condescension, and people need to read Psalm 73, for example, to see what ends up happening to these people. And Psalm 73 is very important in this context. But it's just, you cannot. People just don't. They refuse to believe it. If you tell a lie big enough and often enough, and I think it was Goebbels, he said people will believe it. And Goebbels was a minister of propaganda. Hitler's minister of propaganda, and that's basically, I think, what we're talking about here. People just.
Now, there's something you mentioned that I feel like it's worth getting into, and you're probably the person to get into the subject with. Where, like, I was born and raised as a Southern Baptist in the Deep South, in the state of Mississippi. And these are the fire and brimstone, the apocalypse is nigh kind of Southern Baptist. So I'm really, really well versed in the book of Revelation and the beliefs of those particular denominations of Christians. And one of the core things that they've always been concerned about is that people are going to have some sort of chip implanted in them in order to participate in economic matters, in order to buy and sell things, in order to receive a paycheck. And I understand that that's an enormous concern, especially, I mean, I don't want that. And I no longer would consider myself a Christian, simply because we see how those things could play out with the Chinese social credit system where, you've made the government unhappy, so we're disabling your ability to buy groceries. Like, in a secular standpoint, that's terrifying. But from a religious standpoint, I totally understand why they're equally terrified, because they believe that the Antichrist is going to use this in order to effectively eliminate them. And then these very same people love Elon Musk, who literally owns a company that is trying to put microchips in people's heads. And they've been saying for years that Bill Gates is buying farmland and he wants to microchip us all. And then they love Elon Musk, who is doing exactly that. And that's exactly what the book of Revelation predicted was going to happen, is that these antichrists are going to come along and everyone is going to just absolutely adore them. And it's crazy to me to think that Christians who have long railed against microchips being inserted into people have no issue whatsoever with Donald Trump allying himself with Elon Musk, who literally owns a company designed to do exactly that.
Well, it is ironic, and I'm not completely sold on Trump. I mean, I think he is a wrecking ball to the New World Order, and he's much better than an alternative. Be that as it may, I mean, you bring up a good point. You're probably more well versed in, Elon. Sounds like you are in Elon Musk's and his background, but the mark of the beast is the culmination of biblical prophecy. I mean, it says, if you read it, the King James version says the mark is in your forehead or in your hands. I think many people have accepted it mentally.
Hmm.
The mark of the beast and devil worshippers, for example, your people that own the private Federal Reserve System, or as the all-seeing eye above the uncapped pyramid is an allusion to back to the Genesis 3, but not to go down that rabbit hole right now, but that's exactly correct. Is that the people that are running this thing are just they're just evil. Okay, there's no other way to get around it. It is a you know let me say this. Okay, it's something called the Hegelian dialect. Problem, reaction, solution. So they create the problem, which is unsustainable, unpayable debt, which the Federal Reserve System and the IMF and the World Bank and this sort of thing. Then the system collapses, and the same people come in with the solution, which is going to be, as you mentioned, some sort of microchip or some sort of central CBDC, central bank digital currency,
Yeah.
CBDC, central bank digital currency, where they're going to say, all right, well, that didn't work. Capitalism didn't work and the economy didn't work. It didn't work because they took it over, like we talked about before, with the Federal Reserve System and perpetual debt. But that's going to collapse, as it mathematically and logically must. And they're going to come back in with a solution, and it's going to be CBDCs, but it's going to be with, as you alluded to, a social credit score, which is probably going to be aligned with the mark of the beast, where, oh, you didn't get your vaccine, you're driving a car, you're driving a gas powered car, you don't get any money this month. You're living in a house that's too big. You're using too many resources. You're using too much electricity. There's no more money for your electricity bill. It's going to be that kind of control. And just to jump to something what we haven't mentioned, a lot of this is coming under the guise of environmentalism and global warming, global cooling, climate change, which next to evolution is the biggest scientific scam in world history, but climate change scam is a close second. Okay. But
You
they're
say
going under,
evolution is a scam. In what way?
oh, I mean, I don't know, you want to completely change subjects, but
I mean, that's
evolution.
a pretty strong statement to make, given that natural selection is effectively proven at this point. So I'm curious what causes you to say that it's a scam?
Okay, I mean, that's a complete right turn from what we're talking about, but
Well, you
uh,
brought it up.
yeah, no, I just brought it up as a comparison to environmental movement, but um, I mean, look, on my website, I have posted, evolution debates, and I have debates, and basically, people can listen to that, and it's on my homepage, again, boxofsunglasses.com. But let me just give you the upshot.
Okay.
Basically, evolution as science contradicts the most fundamental laws of science. Now, people say, science is never settled. I don't necessarily agree with that statement, because we have Newton's laws of motion, we have the laws of thermodynamics, we have the law of biogenesis. Okay, so life can't create itself, energy can't create itself. The Earth cannot have existed or I mean, excuse me, the universe could not have existed for infinity, because the second law of thermodynamics says that it would have decayed to nothing by now. As we all know, decay is just a natural process. I mean, a body decays, a tree falls in a forest and dies, it decays.
Well, that would be, I majored in physics, so
That's the
that would be
second law of
applying the second law of
thermodynamics.
thermodynamics out of context, but go on.
No, everything tends to maximum disorder, and that's not really up to debate. I mean, things decay.
Well,
Um,
in contexts, everything decays and entropy increases in closed systems. And we don't know whether or not the universe is even qualified to be called a closed system.
well, I'm talking about in our four-dimensional physical existence we call reality, and then so let's just say that I think we would agree that the universe had a beginning.
No,
Uh,
I don't necessarily agree with that.
okay, well, we're going to have to respectfully disagree, because then you get the Newton's laws of motion, which would contradict the Big Bang, and that was the premise of my debate with all these evolutionists, people, a lot smarter than me, PhD.
Well, evolution has nothing to do with the Big Bang. Those are two entirely separate fields. One is cosmology, and one is biology.
Oh, one you had to have a starting point for evolution to start from.
But they're two entirely different scientific studies, though. Like, one studies how organic material changes over time, and one studies things like gravity.
Yeah, but just going back to the beginning, the universe had to have a beginning for evolution to happen.
Not necessarily, right? It's a matter of the infinite regresses. Something would have had to have created the universe if the universe had a beginning. And so what created that? What created that? It actually goes very well with Newton's law of thermodynamics to say that the universe has just always existed and has only ever just changed forms. There's no need to go beyond that and say, well, the universe was created. We can just, because by an eternal God, we can just say, well, the universe is eternal.
Well, again, I'm going to have to disagree because, for the universe to exist in infinity, everybody exists, the universe is expanding.
It's expanding right now, but there's very strong evidence to believe that it was once, compressed to a single point.
Which, well, then you're getting back to a single point. Then you're kind of trending towards the Big Bang concept.
Well, the Big Bang has actually been kind of deprecated. I think it was Brian Greene who wrote in The Elegant Universe that the Big Bang theory no longer really carries water with scientists. In fact, it seems like there were probably thousands, if not infinite numbers of Big Bangs, and we're just in one little bubble of a Big Bang, and that they're happening all over the universe, and we'll probably never interact with those Big Bangs. But the latest evidence suggests that there isn't a center of the universe that expanded outward, that we're in a center of a bubble, and it's expanding outward, and that there's probably countless of those out there. That's the latest.
Yeah, I mean, look, with all due respect, I think ultimately we're going to have to, agree to disagree on this.
Sure.
It sounds like, you're not a creationist. I'm a biblical creationist.
Sure.
This four-dimensional, three space, one time physical existence we call reality had to be created by something outside of that reality, and that's my belief.
Okay.
That things just don't occur naturally. I mean, they say that things occur naturally, and why couldn't I just say, well, a universe could just pop up right now, in front of this camera, while we're talking?
Well, quantum mechanics tells us that in fact it could. It's just extraordinarily unlikely.
It could, but it's never been proven. So
on a long enough time frame, anything that could happen probably will happen, right?
Well, exactly.
That's just how probability works.
That's what evolution does. Is it just buries its lack of evidence in billions and billions of years.
Well, there's plenty of evidence. There's fossil records. There's all sorts of evidence, and the DNA ties between various species. I think it was a biologist who said that even if there was no fossil record, the DNA evidence alone would convince them, and should convince anyone, that natural selection is in fact a real thing.
Well, I mean, look, if you look at the mathematical statistics of what it would take to create, say a DNA, chain of DNA, random, from complete randomness,
it's not at random. There's a process that occurs over billions of years that leads to the creation of DNA. It's not like rolling 10 million dice and having them get a magical result. It's like rolling 10 dice and keeping the ones that are 3. And then rolling the ones that aren't 3, and eventually, yes, they will all be 3s. It's more like that than just rolling a bunch of dice a million times and hoping that eventually they become all 3s.
Well, somebody needs to control that process, or it's statistically just.
Well, no one needs to control gravity for stuff to fall to the earth, right?
But somebody has to have created the order in the universe. I mean, you're talking about. Let me put it to you this way. I know there's plenty of scientists out there, with experiments, LHC and this sort of thing. I know there's an experiment where I think they took nitrogen and ammonia, and they put it in some kind of flask, and they applied energy to it, and and they had the precursors to amino acids. I mean, I think Christopher Hitchens, the God delusion, and I'm sure you know him.
Yeah, Richard Dawkins.
And Richard Dawkins, and he referred to them, he refers to it in his book, but I mean, to me, that you have to reject that sort of experiment on its face. If you want to prove evolution and randomness and discredit
Well, it's not random. Again, it's not random at all.
The law of biogenesis, then you're a scientific experiment. You take those chemicals and you don't add complexity, you don't add design, you don't add anything to them. You sit them next to each other and you watch them grow into something and take on a life form over billions and billions of years. And that's how you would prove evolution, with no outside force acting on it. It doesn't make any sense to, add complexity and design and energy to an experiment where you're proving that none of those things exist. It's a non-starter to me. And that's just the way it is. Now,
okay.
I think what we're really talking about here, with all due respect, is that is an existence or non-existence of God, which is not really.
True, it's not relevant here.
We're having. That's really what's at the core of this conversation. And I have faith in any creator, and you have faith in randomness over billions and billions of years.
Dude, I've already said repeatedly that none of this entails randomness. I mean, there is a random element in that there are random mutations and stuff like that, but like if you're rejecting natural selection because of its randomness, then that just tells me that you're not listening to what natural selection advocates are telling you. Because I've said like twice now that it's not a matter of randomness. And in order to reject it, you immediately go right back to randomness.
So you're saying that
I'm saying evolution is a process. It's not random.
Things can just evolve. So you're saying that things evolved over billions and billions of years.
I am saying that things evolved over billions and billions of years, yes.
Okay, then why did evolution stop? Why don't we?
It hasn't stopped. We are evolving right now. We are a transitional species to another species right now. But like, you're not going to give birth to a superhuman if that's what one is expecting. No, and we can look and see changes to the human species over the last 5,000 years, over the last 10,000 years, over the last 200,000 years. We can look and see that humans are changing. And this is something that even the Bible supports, right? With allegations that people were shorter than, and so that Goliath, it doesn't support it, but there are takes on the Bible that support it. Let me put it that way. People argue that Goliath wasn't really a giant 20 feet tall. He was just like maybe 7 feet tall. And back then, that was what they considered a giant, because people back then were a little bit shorter, like maybe 5'6" instead of 5'7". And like, we can look at all of this and see that human beings, on average, as an aggregate, are changing over time. And that's what evolution is.
Let me just, excuse me. My son just walked in, but I'll be with him in a minute. But just to, look, I mean, the Bible, you go back to Numbers 13:33, and it talks about Og, the king of Bashan, had a bed that was 9 cubits long, which is like 13 and a half feet. So the Bible does, and you get the whole Nephilim thing in Genesis chapter 6 about mythology and all this sort of thing. And I don't know if you're going to rabbit hole right now, but I think we're just going to have to, agree to disagree. I think you can't just, you can't say things came together over billions of years. There's no scientific way to prove that, just like there's no scientific way to prove God. So again, it all comes down to faith. I mean, you have faith in natural processes that I've yet to be.
I don't know that I would use the word faith.
I have faith in God. And that's what it all boils down to, I think.
Sure, fair enough. I don't disagree with that.
You're never going to agree with me, and I'm never going to agree with you. And and I'll pray to God that people listening and you and come to the realization there is a creator that loves us, and we can get a whole thing. But that's not really science, then, is it? Then we're getting off subject of pure science. So I think we'll just
I guess we should get back to the subject of the deep state because we're running at close to like 50 minutes at this point. So that's already longer than a typical episode of the show. So
Right.
your book again for people, people can find it at boxofsunglasses.com. That's correct.
Yeah.
And well, you have multiple books. I say the book you have, but that's because you recently released the Theory of Livolution, the Great Society of the Undead, but that's not your only book.
No, and let me just, if you don't mind, real quickly. I mean, this is
No, not at all.
the camera. This is what I did is I embedded they live into the theory of evolution.
Okay.
Talked about that, but Great Society of the Undead. Now, the word "great," and we can spend a lot of shows talking about that. I find this has significant meaning to the Apollyon of Revelation chapter 9, and I'll just leave it at that. Without, this is a very quick introduction, but the Great Society is much deeper than just what Lyndon Baines Johnson did after the Kennedy assassination. It's the forerunner to the New World Order, or to this biblical experiment that we were talking about before with the mark of the beast and all that. But that's my first book. Again, this is the Un-American Genocidal Complex. Okay, there's your American Illuminati skull and bones, the Georgia Guidestones, which you need to talk about. The United Nations building. Okay, so
There is a Nazi sign on it. That's why I'm laughing, because like that's ballsy to throw that on there.
yeah.
And
Well,
I assume the book is not pro-Nazi, right?
Oh, no.
Yeah,
No.
Just
No,
wanted
no.
to say that for everyone listening who sees the Nazi sign and flips out.
No, I put that on there because in the book I document how Adolf Hitler was actually a creation from the United States, monetarily and philosophically, survival of the fittest, social Darwinism. We don't want to go back down that road right now, but that was Hitler's philosophy. The Great White Brotherhood, which he was trying to do. But anyway, and then my last book is Pleased to Meet You. Okay, that's just a fictional conversation between a character named O'Brien out of Orwell's 1984 and a Satan character, with a little bit of twist, with a little bit of a kind of a mockery of the Federal Reserve System, which you were talking about before. But those are the three books. And the Un-American Genocidal Complex, I should mention, is probably the most prescient at this point, in terms of current events, in that it documents, the man-made origins of the AIDS virus. I know it's going back, ancient history, so-called, but I think it's the predecessor or the grandfather to today's COVID vaccine. Okay, and then there's government documents in there alluding to that fact and alluding to how the government experiments on the people of the United States. They're in the appendix of that book. So when I see, Alex Jones and all these other Mike Adams on Natural News and other people come out and saying that COVID was a purposely created bioweapon that's killed millions of people, not to mention the vaccines, which are even worse than a disease, that killing tens of millions of people. I have no problem believing it because I've seen precedent. So again, the evil, we're talking about here is ascribable to Satan himself. And, as you're a believer in evolution, more of an atheist, and I'm more of a Christian, and I take the Christian perspective,
But there's no doubt there is evil in the hearts of man, whether put there by Satan or whether just inherent in some people. There's undoubtedly evil in the world.
Jeremiah 17:9, the heart is deceitfully wicked, who can cure it? Of course, Jesus is the cure, and we can spend hours talking about the philosophical aspects of God and the universe, why he created mankind and this sort of thing. But yeah, people without a moral higher ground like the Bible, people suck. I mean, this is how when the founders created the United States and the Constitution, they prescribed, they specified that you have to have a biblical foundation. People have to be governed themselves. They have to be able to behave with very limited government. That was the experiment called the United States and the Constitution. And without that, all bets are off, and we're seeing that. Unfortunately, with the evisceration of God and the Bible out of our society, we're seeing murders, mass murders, school shootings, abortion, everything. Un-American Genocidal Complex. So
people can find more at boxofsunglasses.com. And thank you, Rob, so much for sitting down with me.